The eventide weave did not just hold ships, it held the exhaled breaths of 10,000 dead civilizations. It was a graveyard of chrome and carbon fiber, a place where the light of distant suns came to get strangled by shifting gravitational tides. I had been out here for 3 weeks, drifting through the skeletal remains of what the navigational charts called Ouroboros Reach, and my main takeaway so far was that ghosts were terrible conversationalists. My magnetic boots made a dull, echoing clank against the corroded deck plating of the station's outer ring. Every step felt like a personal insult to the vacuum. I checked my oxygen reserves on the wrist-mounted display of my salvage suit. 2 hours and 15 minutes. Plenty of time to find something worth more than the recycled air I was breathing, or at least something that didn't taste like copper and regret. Sector 7G was a mess. It was the residential arm of the Reach, a place where people had once lived, loved, and probably complained about the local Wi-Fi before the Great Collapse turned the station into an expensive metal tomb. Most scavengers stayed clear of residential zones. There was no heavy tech here, no reactor cores or high-grade fuel cells, just personal effects. Clothes that crumbled to dust at a touch, children's toys that looked like twisted monsters in the beam of a flashlight, and the oppressive sense that I was trespassing on someone's final moments. But my resonance pulse had picked up a faint, rhythmic signature coming from the inner sanctum of the biosphere chamber. It wasn't the jagged spike of a failing battery or the erratic hum of a shorted wire. It was steady, like a drumbeat in the dark. "Listen, Kale," I told myself, my voice sounding tinny and hollow inside the helmet. "You're either about to find a jackpot of ancient medical tech or a very angry, very hungry void leech. Place your bets now." I overrode the locking mechanism of the iris door with a handheld bypass unit. The metal groaned, a high-pitched screech that set my teeth on edge, before stuttering open. I stepped through, my plasma cutter gripped tight in my right hand. It wasn't much of a weapon against anything bigger than a toaster, but it gave me a sense of tactical superiority that I desperately needed. The biosphere chamber had once been a marvel of engineering, a massive, transparent dome designed to house a miniature forest, providing oxygen and a sense of home to the station's inhabitants. Now the glass was frosted with micro-impacts, and the plants were nothing more than petrified gray skeletons, frozen in a permanent winter. At the center of the chamber sat a stasis pod. It wasn't the standard-issue industrial models I was used to seeing. This one was sleek, carved from a single block of translucent obsidian-like material with glowing violet runes etched along its base. It looked less like technology and more like something out of those old fantasy vids my grandfather used to watch. The rhythmic pulse was coming from the pod. I approached cautiously, my heart doing a frantic tap dance against my ribs. As the beam of my helmet lamp hit the interior of the pod, I froze. Inside was a woman. She looked human mostly, but her skin had a faint, ethereal blue luminescence that seemed to glow from beneath the surface. Her hair was a waterfall of spun gold, cascading over shoulders that were too elegant for this dump. But it was her ears that caught me, delicate, sweeping points that reached back toward her skull, looking like carved alabaster. She was beautiful, in a way that made my lungs forget their primary function for a solid 5 seconds. But she was also starving. Even through the stasis field, I could see the sharp lines of her ribs and the hollows in her cheeks. The pod's power levels were in the red, flickering at less than 1%. "Hell of a place to take a nap, Princess," I muttered. I checked the interface. It was written in a script that looked like a bird had walked through ink and then had a seizure on the screen. I couldn't read a word of it, but I knew enough about power flows to see that if I didn't get her out now, the stasis field would collapse and take her along with it. I bypassed the emergency release, the chamber filled with the hiss of escaping gas, a mixture of ancient preservatives and recycled air. The obsidian lid slid back with a whisper, and the woman tumbled forward. I caught her, my gloved hands feeling the surprising weight of her body. She was cold, so cold it felt like she was made of ice. Her eyes snapped open. They were violet, the deep, impossible color of a nebula, and they were wide with a terror that made my stomach do a slow, sick roll. "Hey, easy there," I said, trying to make my voice sound like something other than a gravel-filled radiator. "You're not KIA yet. You're just Well, you're on a dead station with a guy who hasn't had a real shower in 6 weeks. So things could be better, but they could definitely be worse. She didn't speak. She just gripped my forearm with a strength that nearly cracked the ceramic plating of my suit. She looked at me, then at the skeletal trees, and then back at me. There was a profound, crushing sadness in her gaze, the kind of look someone gives when they realize they've woken up in a nightmare. Right, I said, hoisting her up into a carry. Silent type. I can work with that. Let's get you back to my hab module before the air scrubbers in this room decide to quit. It's a bit of a walk, but I've got some gourmet cardboard-flavored nutrition bars waiting for us. I began the long trek back through the darkened corridors of Ouroboros Reach. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just picked up something far more dangerous than a stray survivor. In the eventide weave, you didn't find things by accident. You found them because the universe was tired of keeping secrets. And as I looked down at the glowing woman in my arms, I had a feeling the secret she was keeping was about to make my life a whole lot shorter. The hab module was my tiny pressurized slice of heaven in a universe that wanted me dead. It was basically a repurposed shipping container grafted onto the side of a docking pylon, but it had a working heater, a bunk that was only 50% lumps, and a synthesizer that could produce something vaguely resembling coffee if you kicked it in exactly the right spot. I laid the woman down on the bunk. She looked even smaller here, surrounded by my piles of salvaged wires, rusted gears, and half-finished projects. She watched me with those violet eyes, her head tilted slightly as I checked the atmospheric seals. "Okay, princess," I said, popping the seals on my helmet and taking a deep breath of the filtered, slightly metallic air. "Welcome to Thorn Manor. Don't mind the mess. The maid has been on strike for about 3 decades. She didn't blink. She just stared at me, her gaze drifting to the thermal blanket I draped over her shoulders. "You hungry?" I asked. "Stasis makes your stomach feel like it's trying to digest your spine. I've got the good stuff today, real top-shelf junk." I went to my storage crate and pulled out 2 nutrition bars. They were wrapped in crinkly silver foil that screamed low-budget survivalist. I sat on the floor opposite the bunk, leaning my back against a stack of crates. I broke 1 bar in half and held it out to her. "Here, it's a classic berry flavor, which is a lie because berries haven't existed in this sector since the last century, but it's got enough calories to keep a fusion reactor humming for 20 minutes. She reached out, her fingers trembling. Her skin was still cool, but the blue glow had settled into a soft, pulsing rhythm. She took the piece of the bar, looking at it like I'd handed her a piece of radioactive waste. "You have to eat it, not study it," I prompted, taking a huge, dramatic bite of my own bar. "See, I'm still standing. Mostly. It only tastes like sweetened insulation, I promise." She took a small, tentative bite. Her expression didn't change, but she started chewing with a mechanical focus. After a few seconds, she swallowed and looked at the bar with a flicker of something that might have been surprise. "There we go," I grinned. "Survival step 1. Don't die of starvation. Step 2. Figure out who the hell you are. I'm Kale, by the way. Kale Thorne. Professional junk hauler, part-time philosopher, and currently your only ride out of this ghost town." She looked at me when I spoke her name, but no sound came from her throat. She pointed to herself, then looked around the room, her brow furrowing in confusion. "You don't remember?" I asked, my voice softening. "Not a surprise. Stasis lag is a real B word. It scrambles the brains. My guess? You're some high-ranking refugee from the Inner Rim colonies. That suit of yours, even shredded as it is, looks like it cost more than my ship and my soul combined." She traced the silver embroidery on her sleeve, her expression turning distant. She looked like she was trying to catch a memory that was slipping through her fingers like sand. "Tell you what," I said, leaning my head back against the crates. "Since you're currently nameless, I'm going to call you Nova, because you showed up in a burst of purple light and you're making my life significantly more complicated. Fair deal?" She looked at me for a long moment, then gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "All right, Nova, here's the layout. We're in the eventide weave. It's a gravitational trap. Once you drift in, the only way out is through a high-burn slingshot maneuver around the eventide star. But my ship, the Rust Bucket, is currently missing a primary fuel injector. which means we're stuck here for a bit while I finish scavenging the parts. I stood up and walked over to the small viewport. Outside, the graveyard of ships drifted in the eternal twilight, a jagged landscape of metal and starlight. People think this place is just junk, I said, more to myself than to her. But every piece of scrap out there was someone's dream once, someone's home, someone's grand plan to conquer the stars. Now it's just parts. It's funny how the universe doesn't care about your titles once your life support fails. I turned back to her. She was watching me with an intensity that made me feel like she was reading my DNA. Look, I don't know who was hunting you or why you were shoved into a coffin in the middle of a dead station, I said, my voice turning serious. And honestly, I don't want to know. In my line of work, questions are just expensive ways to get shot, but I don't leave people behind. It's a bad habit of mine. My mother used to say that kindness is the only currency that doesn't devalue when the economy collapses. I thought she was crazy, but here I am, sharing my last classic berry bar with a blue girl from nowhere. Nova reached out and touched my hand. It wasn't a desperate grab this time. It was a gentle pressure. Her violet eyes searched mine, and for a second I saw it. A flash of something ancient, something that had seen empires rise and fall, something that didn't belong in a scavenger's hab module. "You, safe," she whispered. Her voice was like the sound of wind through glass, fragile and sharp all at once. "Whoa, she speaks," I said, trying to keep the mood light to hide the fact that her voice had just given me chills. "Yeah, Nova, you're safe, for now, but don't get too comfortable." I snore. The heater makes a sound like a dying bantha, and I'm about to go back out there to find that fuel injector. "You stay here. Keep the door locked. If anything that isn't me tries to come in, use this." I handed her my secondary plasma cutter. She took it, hefting the weight of the tool with a surprising familiarity. "Don't blow yourself up," I warned, heading for the airlock. "I'd hate to have to find a new roommate. They're hard to come by in this neighborhood." As the airlock cycled, I looked back one last time. Nova was sitting on the bunk, the thermal blanket wrapped around her, clutching the plasma cutter like a scepter. She looked like a queen of a kingdom made of dust and shadows. I stepped out into the cold vacuum of the pylon, my heart feeling a little heavier than it had an hour ago. I told myself it was just the stress of the salvage run, but I knew better. In the eventide weave, you didn't find people like her unless the universe was about to throw a massive wrench into your gears. I had 3 days to fix the rust bucket, 3 days to figure out why a woman who talked like a dream and looked like a goddess was hiding in a graveyard. Because one thing was for sure, a light that bright wouldn't stay hidden in the dark for long. The hegemony was coming. I could feel it in the way the gravity shifted against my suit. They were coming for their Nova, and I was pretty sure they weren't going to pay me in credits for the protein bar. The thing about the eventide weave that nobody tells you in the brochures, mostly because there are no brochures, and anyone who comes here is usually desperate or delusional, is that the silence has different layers. There is the silence of the vacuum, which is just a lack of air to carry sound. Then there is the silence of the scrap, the metallic hush of dead ships that have forgotten they ever had crews. But the worst kind is the silence of a secret. It is heavy, like a lead blanket wrapped around your soul, and it makes every breath you take feel like a confession. I had been out in the pylon for 6 hours, wrestling with a rusted-out bulkhead in the remains of a merchant frigate called the Wandering Star. My goal was a primary fuel injector, a piece of tech roughly the size of a human torso and twice as heavy. It was a finicky, temperamental thing, and the bolts holding it in place had decided to fuse with the frame out of pure, unadulterated spite. I cursed in 3 different languages, none of which were polite, as my wrench slipped for the 5th time. My knuckles were bruised, my oxygen was down to 30%, and my patience was a microscopic dot on the horizon. "Hang in there, Kale," I told myself, wiping a smear of grease across my visor. "You get this injector, you fix the rust bucket, and you get the blue girl to a neutral station where she can be someone else's problem. Simple, logical, the scavenger's way." But my brain kept looping back to the way she had looked at the thermal blanket, like it was a relic from a lost age, like she'd forgotten what warmth felt like. I finally managed to shear off the last bolt with a spray of orange sparks from my plasma cutter. The injector came free with a groan of complaining metal. I caught it against my chest, the weight nearly knocking the wind out of me in the low-gravity environment. I hauled it back toward my hab module, my boots clunking rhythmically against the hollow pylon. When I reached the airlock, I was exhausted, filthy, and smelling like a burnt-out circuit board. I cycled through the chamber, waited for the green light, and stepped inside, expecting to find Nova exactly where I'd left her, sitting on the bunk, staring at the walls. She wasn't on the bunk. She was standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by a swirling cloud of holographic light. I dropped the fuel injector. It hit the deck with a heavy thud, but I didn't even notice. My eyes were fixed on the center of my hab module. The small, battered communication console I'd salvaged from a Hegemony scout ship 2 years ago, a piece of junk that had never done anything but emit static and sadness, was glowing with a fierce, violet radiance. The holograms weren't the flickering, grainy images I was used to. These were crystalline and sharp, showing star charts of terrifying complexity. Thousands of systems, connected by lines of pulsing energy that looked like a galactic nervous system. And in the center of it all was a face. It was Nova's face, but not as I knew it. This woman wore a crown of solidified starlight that seemed to merge with her golden hair. Her skin was a vibrant, royal blue, and her eyes weren't filled with fear. They were filled with the weight of 1 billion lives. Nova, or whoever she was, had her hand hovered over the console. Her fingers weren't touching the buttons. They were moving through the light, dancing with the data as if she were playing an invisible instrument. "Nova," I whispered, my voice cracking. The holograms vanished instantly. The violet light died, leaving only the dim, flickering glow of my emergency lamps. Nova turned to face me, her expression guarded, her hand slowly dropping to her side. The blue luminescence of her skin pulsed once, twice, then settled back into that soft, pale glow. "Kyle," she said. Her voice was stronger now, less like wind through glass, and more like a command she was trying to suppress. "What was that?" I asked, gesturing vaguely at the now silent console. "That wasn't a distress signal. That was a high-level encrypted data burst. Only the Zenith Hegemony uses that kind of recursive frequency. And that face, the one in the crown?" I took a step closer, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm. "Who are you, Nova? And don't give me the 'I don't remember' line. You were just rewriting the operating system of my comm link with your mind. I've seen some strange things in the weave, but that's some high matriarch level voodoo." She looked at the floor, her golden hair veiling her face. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of the air recycler and my own ragged breathing. "I am Vespera," she said softly. "Thiara Vespera Alara, High Matriarch of the Zenith Hegemony, Sovereign of the Thousand Worlds, Keeper of the Chronos Link." I felt the air leave my lungs. I sat down on a crate of spare parts, my legs suddenly feeling like they were made of overcooked noodles. "Great," I muttered, rubbing my face with my hands. "I didn't just find a refugee. I found the most powerful person in the known galaxy. I'm sharing my protein bars with a living goddess." My mother always said I had a knack for picking the most complicated path through a room. "I did not choose to be found," she said, her violet eyes meeting mine with a sudden, sharp intensity. "I fled, Kale. I put myself in that stasis pod and set it for a random trajectory into the Eventide Weave. I wanted to be lost. I wanted the silence." "Why?" I asked, genuinely baffled. "You rule 1,000 worlds. You have legions of soldiers who would die for a smile from you. You have the Chronos Link. You can literally feel the thoughts of your people. Why run to a graveyard?" Vespera walked toward the viewport, looking out at the twisted metal of the weave. "Because I was disappearing," she whispered. "The Chronos Link is not just a tool, Kale. It is a bridge. When I am connected, I feel the hunger of 1 billion children, the greed of 1 million merchants, the grief of 10,000 widows, all at once, all the time. The High Matriarch is not a person. She is a variable in a galactic equation. I was losing the ability to know where Vespera ended and the Empire began." She turned back to me, her expression raw and human. "In the Hegemony, I am a symbol, a beacon. But I wanted to know if I was still real. I wanted to see if someone would look at me and see a woman, not a god. I wanted to see if kindness existed without the threat of imperial sanction. I looked at the half-eaten nutrition bar on the bunk, then back at her. So the protein bar was a test, I asked, a hint of my usual sarcasm returning to mask the sheer terror I was feeling. Am I being graded? Because I'm pretty sure sweetened insulation doesn't get me an A+. Vesper gave a small, genuine smile. It was a beautiful sight, one that made the cramped, dirty HAB module feel like a palace. You gave me the larger half, she said. You didn't ask for my name, or my rank, or my loyalty. You just saw someone who was hungry and cold, and you shared what you had. That is a currency the hegemony has forgotten, Kale. I stood up, shaking my head. Look, Your Majesty, I'm honored, really. But the fact that you just activated that console means you've basically lit a signal fire in the middle of a dark forest. If I can track a data burst from that console, the hegemony's scout ships will be here in less than 12 hours. We need to move. Now. They are already here, she said, her voice turning cold and flat. At that exact moment, the proximity alarm on my wrist comp began to shriek. It was a high-pitched, urgent sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. I scrambled to the main sensor display, my fingers flying over the keys. Scanning. 3 ships. No, 4, I reported, my voice tight. Fast attack interceptors, Zenith class. They just jumped into the outer rim of the weave. They're running a grid search pattern. They'll find the Ouroboros signature in 20 minutes and my HAB module in 30. I grabbed my flight jacket and my heavy-duty wrench. Change of plans, Nova, Vespera, whatever. We're not fixing the rust bucket tomorrow. We're fixing it now. We have to bug out before those V-heads realize we're here. If they find us, they'll take you back to your throne, and they'll probably turn me into stardust just for touching your hand. Vespera didn't move. She stood in the center of the room, her gaze fixed on the door. They will not harm you, she said. Maybe not on purpose, I countered, shoving the fuel injector back into its transport bag. Not in the hegemony. Protection usually involves a lot of collateral damage. Now move. That's a direct order from your favorite scavenger. She blinked, surprised by my tone, then nodded. She followed me out into the pylon, the violet glow of her skin pulsing with a new, urgent energy. As we ran through the darkened corridors, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. She'd run away to find herself, to see if she was more than just a crown. And I, a guy who had spent my whole life running from responsibility, was now responsible for the fate of a goddess. We reached the docking bay where the rust bucket was tethered. It was a battered, ugly ship, a patchwork of different eras and technologies, but it was mine, and right now it was our only hope. Get inside, I told her, pointing to the airlock. I have to install the injector from the exterior access port. It'll take me 10 minutes. If you see anything glowing purple that isn't you, close the hatch. She looked at me, her violet eyes wide. Kyle, go, I barked. I scrambled up the side of the ship, my magnetic gloves gripping the cold hull. I could see the starlight reflecting off the distant scrap of the weave, but now there were new lights. 4 bright, clinical glints that were moving toward us with predatory precision. 12 minutes, I thought, my hands moving with a speed born of pure panic. I have 12 minutes to save an empress in my own miserable skin. I began to work, the silence of the vacuum pressing in on me. But this time, it was different. I wasn't just working for credits anymore. I was working for a choice, and in the eventide weave, a choice was the most expensive thing you could ever find. Installing a primary fuel injector while drifting in a zero-gravity graveyard is roughly equivalent to performing heart surgery while riding a roller coaster. Every movement has an equal and opposite reaction, and if you don't brace yourself correctly, you end up spinning off into the hard vacuum like a discarded soda can. I was wedged into the rust bucket's engine cowling, my legs locked around a structural rib, my hands buried deep in the guts of the ship. The injector was a stubborn beast, refusing to seat properly into the fuel line. Come on, you piece of junk, I hissed through gritted teeth. I've spent 3 years keeping you in one piece. Don't quit on me when I finally have a girl on board. The proximity sensor in my helmet chirped again. 2 kilometers. The hegemony interceptors had cleared the debris field and were closing in on the docking pylon. They weren't using their main thrusters. They were drifting on RCS puffs, trying to remain stealthy. But you can't hide the thermal signature of a Zenith-class reactor from a man who spends his life hunting for heat. Kyle, they are entering the pylon, Vesper's voice came over the comms. She sounded remarkably calm, which was annoying given that I was currently sweating enough to short-circuit my cooling vest. I know, I shouted back, giving the injector one final, desperate shove. There was a satisfying clack as the locking collars engaged. I didn't wait to check the seals. I slapped the access panel shut, magnetized it, and kicked off the hull. I flew toward the airlock like a clumsy bird, my hands flailing until I grabbed the handle. I tumbled inside, slammed the cycle button, and waited for the agonizingly slow repressurization. The moment the inner hatch opened, I didn't even take off my helmet. I ran for the cockpit, vaulting over a pile of scrap metal that I'd been meaning to organize for 6 months. Vesper was already there, strapped into the co-pilot's seat. She looked completely out of place against the greasy, flickering displays of the rust bucket, but her hands were moving across the secondary console with a speed that made my head spin. I have initialized the pre-flight sequence, she said, her eyes fixed on the sensor array. But the reactor is only at 40% power. We cannot engage the jump drive. We don't need the jump drive, I said, slamming into the pilot's seat and punching the manual override for the docking clamps. In this mess of scrap, a jump drive would just smear us across a dozen dead hulls. We're going to do a slingshot. I gripped the flight sticks, feeling the familiar vibration of the ship's engines as they coughed into life. The rust bucket groaned, a sound like a giant stretching his joints after a long nap. A slingshot? Vesper asked, her brow furrowed. Around what? There are no planetary bodies in the weave. Not planets, I said, a manic grin spreading across my face. The Eventide star. It's a white dwarf at the center of this gravity well. It's small, it's dense, and it's got enough gravitational pull to hurl us out of this sector at 3% the speed of light if we hit the angle just right. That is extremely dangerous, she noted. The radiation alone is better than an imperial prison, I finished for her. Hold on to your crown, princess. This is going to get bumpy. I slammed the throttles forward. The rust bucket surged, the sudden acceleration pinning us back into our seats. We cleared the docking pylon just as a beam of violet light lanced through the space where we'd been sitting. A warning shot. They have spotted us, Vesper said, her voice tightening. They are signaling for us to power down and prepare for boarding. They are identifying themselves as the first guard of the High Matriarch. Yeah, well, tell them the High Matriarch is busy having the time of her life, I said, banking the ship hard to the left. We dived into the thickest part of the debris field. It was a chaotic forest of twisted metal, shattered glass, and frozen ship husks. I wove the rust bucket through the gaps, using the larger wrecks as cover. Behind us, the 4 interceptors followed, their sleek, bioluminescent hulls glowing like predatory deep-sea fish. They were faster than us, much faster, but they were also bigger, and their pilots were used to open space combat, not dogfighting in a metallic graveyard. I grazed the hull of a dead dreadnought, the sound of metal scraping metal echoing through the cockpit. Kyle, the port shield is at 20%, Vesper warned. I'm working on it, I yelled, pulling a sharp U-turn around a floating fuel tank. One of the interceptors tried to follow, but it couldn't match the rust bucket's erratic maneuvering. It clipped the fuel tank, sending it spinning into a nearby freighter in a spectacular, noiseless explosion of orange and white. 1 down, 3 to go. Why are you doing this? Vesper asked suddenly. Her voice was quiet, almost lost beneath the roar of the engines and the scream of the alarms. Doing what? Trying not to die? It's a hobby of mine, I said, dodging a cluster of frozen escape pods. No, she said, turning to look at me. Why are you risking your life for me? You could have handed me over. They would have paid you more credits than you could count in a lifetime. You could have been a hero of the hegemony. I paused for a fraction of a second, my hands steady on the sticks. I had a family once, Vespera, I said, my voice dropping an octave. Not a biological one. I was an orphan on a colony ship. I was raised by a crew of grease monkeys and scavengers who didn't share a drop of blood with me. But they taught me something. They taught me that you don't choose your family because of a DNA test. You choose them because they're the ones who stay when everyone else bugger off. I looked at her, and for a moment, the cockpit of the rust bucket felt 1,000 kilometers wide. I spent 10 years in the military. I saw people follow orders because of duty, because of blood, because of fear. It never ended well. But out here, in the junk, you choose who you stand with. And I chose you, Nova. Not because you're an empress, but because you're the first person in 5 years who made me laugh at a breakfast narration. Vespera didn't say anything, but the violet glow of her skin intensified, a warm, pulsing light that seemed to fill the cockpit. She reached out and placed her hand over mine on the flight stick. I choose to stay as well, she whispered. Good, I said, my voice rough, because here comes the fun part. We cleared the debris field and saw it, the eventide star. It was a tiny, brilliant point of light surrounded by a swirling disk of white-hot gas. The gravity was immense, a physical weight that pressed down on us, making every movement a struggle. Initialize the heat shields, I commanded. We're going in hot. The rust bucket began to shake, a violent, bone-jarring vibration that felt like the ship was being torn apart. Outside, the world turned into a blur of blinding white light and streaks of radiation. The hegemony interceptors hesitated at the edge of the star's gravity well. They were built for precision, for elegance. They weren't built for a suicide dive into a white dwarf. They are peeling off, Vesper shouted over the roar. They cannot follow us into the corona. Then let's give them something to remember us by, I yelled. I engaged the manual boosters. The fuel injector I'd just installed screamed in protest, but it held. We accelerated, the gravity of the star pulling us in, wrapping around us like a giant's hand. We skimmed the very edge of the event horizon, the temperature in the cockpit soaring to 40 degrees Celsius. I felt the moment we hit the sweet spot. The gravity shifted from a pull to a push. Slingshot engaged, I roared. The rust bucket was catapulted forward with a force that made my vision go black at the edges. We were a streak of silver light, a needle of defiance being threaded through the eye of a cosmic storm. 1 second, we were in the heart of the fire. The next, we were hurtling into the deep black of the outer systems, the eventide weave falling away behind us like a bad memory. The silence returned. But this time it wasn't heavy. It was light. I slumped back in my seat, my chest heaving, the sweat dripping off my chin. I looked over at Vespera. Her hair was a mess, her royal clothing was stained with grease, and she was breathing just as hard as I was. She looked at me, and then she started to laugh. It was a wild, joyful sound, the sound of a woman who had just realized she was alive. That was, she searched for the word, terrifying. Absolutely, profoundly terrifying. Welcome to my world, Your Majesty, I grinned, reaching for the half-melted coffee bulb in the cup holder. Care for a celebratory sip of recycled sludge? She took the bulb, toasted me with a mock seriousness, and took a drink. She winced at the taste, but she didn't stop smiling. Where are we going? She asked, looking out at the unfamiliar stars. Somewhere far, I said, beginning to plot a course for the Kepler belt. Somewhere where the hegemony is just a story and the protein bars are actually flavored with real fruit. We've got a long way to go, Nova. I don't mind, she said, leaning her head back against the headrest. As long as you keep talking, Kyle, I find your narration comforting. I looked at her, and for the first time in 32 years, I didn't feel like a scavenger looking for scrap. I felt like a man who had found something that no amount of credits could ever buy. Well, I said, clearing my throat and adopting my best cooking show voice. In today's episode of Surviving the Void, we're going to learn how to fix a cracked coolant line using nothing but gum and a sense of existential dread. But first, a word from our sponsor, the Zenith Hegemony, who would really like their Empress back, but she's currently busy being part of a family. Vespera laughed again, and as we sailed into the unknown, I knew that whatever happened next, it wouldn't be because of destiny. It would be because we chose it, together. The rust bucket hummed, its new fuel injector pulsing with a steady, reliable beat, carrying a scavenger and a goddess toward a future that was, for the first time, entirely their own. Life in the Kepler belt was a relentless exercise in managed catastrophe. It was a sprawling, chaotic necklace of silicate rock and iron, orbiting a dying red giant that cast everything in a hue of dried blood. For a scavenger, it was a gold mine. For a fugitive empress and a man whose most valuable possession was a sentient wrench, it was a gauntlet of frozen hazards. We had been drifting through the outer rim of the belt for 14 days. The slingshot maneuver around the eventide star had left the rust bucket's internal systems screaming for mercy. The hull was scorched, the life support was wheezing like a heavy smoker after a marathon, and the primary fuel injector I'd nearly died installing was making a rhythmic clunk-whir sound that suggested it was contemplating early retirement. I was currently waist-deep in the secondary coolant manifold, elbow-deep in a slurry of green thermal paste. "Hand me the torque driver, Nova," I grunted, my voice echoing off the narrow walls of the engine crawlspace. "The one with the blue handle, not the one that looks like a miniature railgun." Vespera, whom I still called Nova when I wasn't feeling particularly intimidated by her royal heritage, leaned into the hatch. She had traded her shredded imperial silks for a set of my old flight coveralls. They were 3 sizes too big, the sleeves rolled up in thick bunches around her delicate blue wrists, and she'd tied her golden hair back with a strip of industrial lace. She looked less like a goddess and more like a very confused apprentice mechanic. She handed me the tool, her violet eyes tracking my movements with a curiosity that was almost unsettling. "Is it always like this?" she asked. "This constant cycle of fracture and repair? It seems inefficient." "In the hegemony, we have automated nanites that maintain the structural integrity of our vessels. A ship is a living organism, not a collection of complaints." "Well, out here in the real world, we don't have magic dust to fix our problems," I said, tightening a valve until it groaned. "We have sweat, swearing, and the hope that the previous owner didn't skip out on the maintenance logs. This ship isn't an organism, Nova. It's a survivor, like me. It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be enough." I pulled myself out of the manifold, wiping a glob of coolant off my forehead with the back of my hand. I looked at her, and my heart did that weird, jagged little hop it always did when she was nearby. She was studying a cracked pressure gauge like it was a holy relic. "You're testing it again, aren't you?" I asked, leaning back against the vibrating bulkhead. "Testing what?" "Humanity, life without the magic dust. You're looking for the lesson in the grease." Vesper sat down on a crate of spare hydraulic fluid, her elongated ears tilting forward. "I am observing. In the palace, I made decisions for 30 sectors. If a ship was damaged, I saw it as a percentage drop in regional trade efficiency. I never saw the man in the crawl space. I never heard the sound of the torque driver." She reached out and touched the vibrating wall of the engine room. "I can feel the ship's pulse, Cal. It is faint and it is struggling, but it is real. Everything here is so loud. My thoughts are no longer drowned out by the billions. For the first time in 400 years, I can hear my own heartbeat." "Must be a quiet song," I muttered, looking away. "It is a terrifying song," she corrected me softly, "because I am beginning to realize that when you are just a person, the things you lose don't come back. If this ship fails, we die. There is no backup consciousness to download, no secondary vessel to inherit the crown. It makes every moment feel heavy." I knew that heaviness. I'd lived with it since I was 10 years old, watching the stars from the underside of a generation ship. It was the weight of knowing you were fragile. "That's the secret, Nova," I said, standing up and offering her a hand. "The fragility is what makes the protein bars taste like, well, not like cardboard, but like something. It's what makes the whiskey burn. If you can't lose it, you don't really own it." She took my hand, her cool skin sending that familiar jolt of static through my arm. For a second, we just stood there in the flickering light of the engine room, a scavenger and a queen, caught in the static between who we were and who we wanted to be. The moment was shattered by the comms console in the cockpit. It wasn't the shriek of a proximity alarm this time. It was a broad-spectrum emergency broadcast, a signal that was being repeated across every civilian frequency in the sector. We scrambled to the bridge. I punched the audio decryption key, and a voice filled the cabin. It was frantic, distorted by the interference of the red giant's radiation, but the fear in it was crystal clear. "This is the Hollow Heart refugee colony. We are under fire. The Iron Syndicate has breached the outer atmosphere domes. They are taking everyone. Please, if there are any civilian vessels in range, we are 5,000 civilians. We have no defense. They are burning the oxygen scrubbers. Please. The signal dissolved into a harsh, grinding static. I looked at the sensor map. Hollow Heart was an abandoned mining asteroid 2 sectors over. It was a pit, a place for people who had nowhere else to go. The Iron Syndicate were bottom feeders, pirates who specialized in human salvage, taking refugees and selling them into the labor camps of the Outer Rim. Kyle, Vespera said, her voice dropping into that tone of absolute authority, we are the closest ship. We are a salvage tug with a leaking coolant manifold and exactly 1 plasma cutter, I countered, my hands shaking as I looked at the coordinates. Going in there isn't a rescue mission. It's a suicide pact. We're outgunned, outmanned, and our ship is held together by prayers and duct tape. There are 5,000 lives, she said, her violet eyes glowing with a fierce, royal light. 5,000 people who are being treated as variables in a pirate's equation. You taught me that kindness is a choice, Kale. You chose me when I was just a girl in a box. Will you choose them? I looked at the sensor screen, then back at her. This was the turning point. This was where the slice of life ended and the cost of being human began. I could stay in the shadows. I could keep her safe. I could let Hollow Heart burn and keep my life and my ship. But if I did that, I wouldn't be the man she thought I was. And she wouldn't be the woman who had laughed at my breakfast. Damn it, I hissed, slamming my fist against the pilot's console. I really hate it when you use my own philosophy against me. I grabbed the flight sticks and banked the rust bucket toward the heart of the Kepler belt. Buckle up, Your Majesty, I growled, my scavenger instincts giving way to something much more dangerous. We're going to go talk to some pirates, and I'm going to use some very, very rude words. The approach to Hollow Heart was like flying through a meat grinder. The Iron Syndicate had deployed 3 heavy-duty raider ships, blocky, ugly things bristling with scavenged cannons, and they were currently methodically dismantling the asteroid's defense turrets. Keep us in the sensor shadows of the larger rocks, I commanded, my eyes darting between the radar and the visual feed. If they spot us before we get to the docking bay, we're scrap metal before I can even finish a witty remark. Vespera was focused on the tactical overlay. They are targeting the life support hubs first. It is a standard intimidation tactic. Drain the air, and the resistance collapses. It is efficient. Stop calling it efficient, I snapped. It's murder. I know, she said, her voice small. I am trying to reconcile the logic I once used with the reality I am seeing. I used to sign decrees that authorized resource reallocation in border sectors. I called them necessary sacrifices for the greater stability. I never saw the smoke, Kale. I never smelled the ozone of a burning dome. Well, you're smelling it now, I said, as the rust bucket cleared the final asteroid cluster. Hollow Heart was a jagged lump of nickel iron, surrounded by a thin, flickering atmosphere membrane. Huge plumes of fire were erupting from the residential sectors, and I could see the tiny ant-like shapes of syndicate boarding craft swarming the docking ports. I'm going to drop us in through the maintenance hatch in Sector 4, I said, my voice tight. It's narrow, it's dangerous, and the rust bucket is going to lose some paint. Once we're inside, I'll head for the air scrubbers. You stay with the ship. If I don't come back in 20 minutes, I am coming with you, Vesper said. No way. You're the Empress of 1,000 worlds. If you get captured, the Syndicate won't just sell you. They'll hold the entire galaxy for ransom. You are too valuable to lose, Nova. That is exactly why I must go, she said, standing up. She looked at me, and the violet in her eyes was so deep it looked like a black hole. For 4 centuries, I have been too valuable to act. I have been a spectator in my own empire. Today, I choose to be a participant. If I am to be an empress, I must first be a person who stands for those who cannot. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her she was being a scrap brain, a reckless royal who didn't understand the first thing about a street fight. But the look on her face stopped me. It was the same look I'd had when I walked away from the military, the look of someone who had finally found a line they wouldn't cross. Fine, I grunted, grabbing a second plasma cutter from the lockers. But if you get a scratch on those royal ears, I'm never letting you hear the end of it. We docked with a bone-jarring slam. The maintenance hatch opened into a corridor filled with thick black smoke and the screams of the dying. The air was thin, tasting of burnt plastic and copper. "Move!" I yelled, pulling her along. We fought our way toward the central hub. It wasn't like the vids. It was messy, loud, and terrifying. We encountered a pair of syndicate thugs near the primary airlock, hulking men in patchwork armor, carrying slug throwers. "Drop 'em, you deck rats!" I roared, leading with the plasma cutter. I wasn't a soldier anymore, but the muscle memory was there. I ducked a shot that whistled past my ear and lanced the first pirate through the shoulder. He went down with a howl. The second pirate leveled his weapon at me, but before he could pull the trigger, a blast of pure violet energy erupted from Vespera's hand. It wasn't a weapon. It was the Chronos link, channeled through her physical form. The pirate didn't just fall. He seemed to freeze, his eyes wide as he was flooded with the weight of 1,000 perspectives. He slumped to the ground, unconscious and shivering. Vespera leaned against the wall, her skin glowing a fierce, angry blue. She was shaking. I felt his mind," she whispered. "The greed, the rot. It was like drowning in filth." "Keep breathing, Nova," I said, grabbing her shoulders. "Don't let him in. Focus on me. Focus on the air." We reached the air scrubber control room. It was a wreck. The syndicate had smashed the consoles and planted a thermal charge on the main oxygen tank. The timer on the charge showed 3 minutes. 3 minutes until 5,000 people suffocated in the dark. "I can't disarm this," I said, my hands trembling as I looked at the wiring. "It's a syndicate special. It's designed to blow if you even look at it wrong. I need more time. I need at least 10 minutes to bypass the trigger." "We don't have 10 minutes, Vesper said. She walked toward the tank, her hand reaching out for the thermal charge. "Nova, get back. It'll vaporize you." "I am the High Matriarch," she said, her voice echoing with a power that made the room vibrate. "I am the vessel of the hegemony. If I can hold the thoughts of a billion, I can hold the heat of a single star." She placed her hands over the charge. A sphere of violet light expanded from her palms, wrapping around the explosive. The timer hit 0. The explosion happened, but it was muffled, contained within the field of Vespera's power. I watched in horror as her body arched, her skin glowing so bright it was blinding. She was absorbing the kinetic energy, the heat, the raw destruction. She was a living containment field. The light died. Vespera collapsed, her skin pale, almost gray. The thermal charge was a smoking ruin, but the oxygen tank was intact. "Nova!" I scrambled to her, pulling her into my lap. "Talk to me! Wake up, you crazy empress! Wake up!" Her eyes fluttered open. They were dull. The violet faded to a pale lavender. "The air," she coughed. "Is it enough?" "Yeah," I choked out, a tear carving a path through the grease on my cheek. "It's enough. You did it. You saved them." She gave a weak, tired smile. Then, the currency held its value. I carried her back to the rust bucket just as the colony's remaining security forces managed to drive off the raiders. We didn't stay for the cheers. We didn't stay to be heroes. I just wanted to get her away from the smoke. As we cleared the asteroid's gravity well and drifted back into the silence of the belt, I sat in the cockpit, watching her sleep on the bunk through the monitor. She had risked everything for a colony of strangers. She had chosen to suffer so they could breathe. But as I checked the long-range sensors, my blood turned to ice. The data burst from the Ouroboros console had done more than just attract a few interceptors. The hegemony was in chaos. With the High Matriarch missing, the shattered Sons Accord, the peace treaty that kept the core systems from civil war, had been torn up. 3 sectors away, a full-scale fleet engagement was happening. Millions were dying because the goddess had gone for a walk. I looked at the woman on the bunk. She had found her humanity, but in doing so, she might have broken the galaxy. "Choice," I whispered, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "It's a hell of a thing, isn't it, Nova?" I realized then that the lesson wasn't just about kindness, it was about the cost. Every time you choose to be a person, you stop being a symbol. And the universe really loves its symbols. I set a course for the deepest, darkest part of the Kepler belt. We were no longer just running from the hegemony. We were running from the consequences of a protein bar, and those I realized were the hardest things in the galaxy to outrun. The Iron Ribs was a place where the sun never reached, a skeletal shipyard clinging to the underside of a massive frozen planetoid. It was the kind of location that made the Eventide Weave look like a bustling metropolis. Here the silence was absolute, a heavy velvet curtain that muffled the sound of the rust bucket's dying engines. I had drifted us into a shadow so deep it felt like the universe had simply forgotten we existed. It had been 4 days since the rescue at Hollowheart, and those 4 days had been a slow-motion descent into a particular kind of hell. Vespera was dying, not in the way a normal person dies, of a wound or a sickness, but in a way that was uniquely, cruelly imperial. Absorbing that thermal charge had done more than just burn her skin. It had fractured the delicate lattice of her consciousness. The blue luminescence that once pulsed with the rhythm of her heart was now erratic, flickering like a dying neon sign in a rainstorm. I sat on the floor of the medical bay, my back against the vibrating wall, watching her breathe. Every inhale was a struggle, a jagged rasp that tore at my chest more than any plasma burn ever could. "Kyle," she whispered, her eyes opening. They were no longer violet. They were a dull, milky lavender, the color of a fading sunset. "I'm here, Nova," I said, sliding closer and taking her hand. Her skin was unnaturally hot, humming with a residual energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Just rest. The ship is stable. We're hidden. Nobody is coming for a while." "You are a terrible liar," she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I can hear the sensors. You have them set to a wideband sweep. You are waiting for the shadow to move." "It's just a precaution," I muttered, looking away. "Scavenger habits. You never trust a dark corner until you've poked it with a stick." She squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone whose body was failing. "Cal, I can feel the weave. Not the station, but the connection. The Chronos link it is reaching for me, across the light years. It is screaming." "Let it scream," I hissed, the anger bubbling up before I could stop it. "It's a machine, Vespera. It's an engine of cold logic that turns you into a battery. It doesn't get to have you back, not after what you did for those people at the colony." "It is not a machine," she said softly, her gaze drifting to the ceiling. "It is the sum of every soul in the hegemony, and right now, those souls are in agony. I can feel the fires in the Helion cluster. I can feel the fear of the children in the outer rim. They are calling for their matriarch, and all they find is silence." I stood up, pacing the tiny room. I felt like a caged animal. "And what about you? What about the girl who wanted to see if she was real? If I take you back, they'll plug you into that throne and you'll disappear. Vespera will be gone, replaced by a variable. Is that what you want? To become a god again at the cost of being alive?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I know that if I stay here, I am being selfish with a life that was never entirely mine." "You taught me that kindness is a choice, Kale. But what if the kindest thing I can do is to sacrifice my own peace for the lives of billions?" "That's not kindness," I snapped, stopping at the foot of her bunk. "That's math, and I'm tired of math. I'm tired of everyone being a number. You're not a variable to me. You're the woman who thinks my coffee tastes like sludge, but drinks it anyway because I made it for you. That has to matter for something." I sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands. The weight of the decision was crushing us both. If I kept her here, she would fade away, her mind consumed by the energy she had absorbed. If I took her back, she would be saved. But the woman I loved would be erased by the demands of an empire. "Choice is a hell of a thing," I whispered, echoing my thoughts from the cockpit. "It is the only thing that makes us more than the scrap," she replied. The proximity alarm chose that moment to scream. It wasn't the frantic chirp of a pirate raider or the clinical beep of a scout. It was a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very hull of the ship, a signature of overwhelming power. I ran to the cockpit, my heart in my throat. On the sensor screen, a single ship had emerged from the void. It wasn't an interceptor. It was the Hegemony Dawn, the flagship of the Imperial Guard. A vessel the size of a small city, carved from obsidian and starlight. It loomed over the iron ribs like a god of judgment. "They found us," I breathed. "I don't even know how, but they found us." "They didn't find us, Kyle," Vesper said from the doorway. She was leaning against the frame, her face pale but her eyes burning with a sudden, terrifying clarity. "I called them." I turned, my jaw dropping. "You what?" "I used the comm link while you were sleeping," she said, her voice steady. "I sent a subspace pulse. I told them my coordinates." "Oh, why?" I shouted, the betrayal cutting deeper than any blade. "We were safe. We were going to find a way to fix you." "There is no fixing this without the Imperial medtech, Kyle," she said, walking toward me with a grace that shouldn't have been possible. "And even if there were, I cannot let the galaxy burn while I play at being a scavenger's partner. I am the High Matriarch. That is my burden. But I wanted you to know, I wanted one last moment where it was just us, where I was just Nova." She reached out and touched my cheek. Her hand was shaking. "You gave me that, Kale. You gave me 10 days of being a person. You shared your last meal with a stranger, and in doing so, you saved my soul. Now let me save my people." A transport shuttle detached from the Hegemony Dawn, drifting toward our docking port with an inevitability that made my knees weak. I looked at the screen, then at the woman standing in front of me. The humanistic theme I had been clinging to, that family is a choice, was being tested by the ultimate authority. Was I her family, or was the Empire? "If you go through that door," I said, my voice thick with unshed tears, "they won't let me see you again. You know that. I'm a nobody, a deck rat, a deserter. They'll probably throw me into a black hole prison just for looking at you." "They will try," she said, her eyes glowing with a sudden, fierce violet light. "But they forget one thing. I am the Empress, and the Empress has made a choice." The airlock hissed open. Commander Valen stepped through, surrounded by a dozen soldiers in starlight armor. He was a man made of stone and protocol, his face unreadable behind his crystalline visor. He looked at the cramped, filthy cockpit of the rust bucket with a disgust that was almost palpable. "Radiance," he said, dropping to one knee. The soldiers followed suit, their armor clinking in unison. "We have searched across 20 sectors. The Imperium is in chaos. Your return is the only thing that can stop the collapse." Vespera stood tall, her chin lifted, the weight of 1,000 worlds settling back onto her shoulders. But she didn't move toward the shuttle. She stayed right where she was, her hand still resting on my arm. "Stand up, Commander," she said, her voice echoing with a power that made the cockpit lights flicker. "And listen carefully, because the rules of the hegemony are about to change." I looked at her, stunned. She wasn't just going back. She was bringing the fire with her. The transition from the rust bucket to the Hegemony Dawn was like moving from a cardboard box into a cathedral. Everything was too bright, too clean, and too silent. The air smelled of ozone and expensive incense, a far cry from the grease and recycled sweat I'd grown accustomed to. I was escorted by 4 guards, their weapons held at a respectful but firm distance. They hadn't shackled me. Vesper had made it very clear that any attempt to restrain me would result in the immediate execution of the officer in charge. But I still felt like a specimen under a microscope. They took me to a suite of rooms that was larger than the entire Ouroboros Reach. The walls were made of shifting holographic silk, displaying scenes of peaceful forests and mountains I'd only ever seen in history files. A service bot offered me a robe of spun silver and a meal that consisted of things I couldn't identify, but which smelled like heaven. I ignored it all. I paced the room, my boots clicking on the polished floor, until the doors hissed open and Commander Valen stepped inside. He had removed his helmet, revealing a face scarred by decades of service and eyes that were as cold as a void frost. "The High Matriarch is in the healing chambers," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The damage to her neural lattice is severe, but our medical tech is capable of stabilizing her. Within 24 hours, she will be ready to reconnect with the Chronos link." "And then what?" I asked, stopping in front of him. "She becomes a vegetable with a crown? A meat puppet for your treaties?" Valen's eyes narrowed. "You speak with a boldness that is either very brave or very stupid, Scavenger. You have no idea what is at stake. The hegemony is a delicate balance of 10,000 variables. Without the matriarch to anchor the link, the systems drift. They fight. They die. Her duty is to be the anchor. She's a person, Valen, I said, stepping into his space. She has a name. Vespera. Not radiance, not anchor. She's a woman who likes terrible jokes and thinks kindness is a currency. Have you ever even asked her what she wants? What she wants is irrelevant, Valen snapped. What she is everything. You are a pebble in a landslide, Thorn. You think your little adventure in the weave changed anything? You were a distraction, a momentary lapse in her divine focus. Once she is back on the throne, she will forget you ever existed. I don't think she will, a voice said from the doorway. Vespera stood there, supported by two medical droids. She was wearing a gown of deep violet, her skin glowing with a renewed, healthy light. The gray pallor was gone, replaced by a vibrancy that seemed to hum with the energy of the ship itself. But her eyes were still the ones that had looked at me in the rust bucket. Commander, leave us, she commanded. Valen bowed, a stiff, reluctant movement. Radiance, the Council is waiting. The situation in the Helion cluster. The Council can wait another 10 minutes, she said, her voice cutting through his protest like a laser. I have not yet finished my conversation with my family. Valen's eyes flicked to me, filled with a sudden, sharp confusion, before he turned and marched out of the room. The guards followed, the doors sealing behind them. Vespera walked toward me, the droids hovering at a respectful distance. She looked like a goddess again, but when she reached out to take my hands, her fingers were warm and real. He thinks I am a variable, she said softly. He thinks the Chronos link is a cage that will swallow me whole. Is he wrong? I asked, my voice cracking. Vespera, if you plug back into that thing, if you feel the thoughts of a billion people again, how can you possibly stay you? How can you remember the protein bars? Because of you, Kyle, she said, her gaze intense. The mistake the hegemony made, the mistake I made for 400 years, was thinking that the matriarch had to be alone to be impartial. They thought that to love everyone, I could love no one. They turned me into a vortex, drawing everything in but holding on to nothing. She pulled me closer, her forehead resting against mine. But you showed me something else. You showed me that an anchor isn't a weight that holds you down. It's a connection that keeps you from drifting away. I am going back to the throne, Kyle. I have to. There are too many people dying for me to stay hidden. But I am not going back as a variable. What are you saying? I am going to change the protocol, she whispered. I am going to tell the council that the High Matriarch is no longer a solitary entity. I am going to appoint a consort of the Reach, a man who knows the smell of grease and the taste of bad coffee, a man who will stay beside me not as a subject, but as a reminder of what it means to be human. I felt the world tilt on its axis. You're crazy? They'll never accept it. They'll revolt. You're talking about breaking 4,000 years of tradition. Let them revolt, she said, a flash of the old imperial steel in her voice. I am the one who holds the link. If they want their empress, they take her as she is, with her flaws, with her choices, with her scavenger. I looked into her eyes and saw the future. It wasn't the quiet, simple life I had imagined in the Kepler belt. It was going to be loud, dangerous, and filled with a million people who hated me for being a nobody. I would be the most hated man in the galaxy, a target for every assassin and politician, from here to the eventide weave. But then I looked at the way she was holding my hands, like I was the only thing keeping her from flying apart. Family is a choice. I'm going to need a lot more than 17 stiff drinks to handle this, I muttered, a slow grin spreading across my face. Vespera laughed, and for the first time, the sound didn't feel like it was echoing in a tomb. It felt like it was echoing through the halls of a new kind of empire. We have work to do, Kale Thorn, she said, pulling me toward the door. The galaxy is a mess, the trade routes are in shambles, and I'm pretty sure the Merchant Guild is planning a coup. Are you ready to help me narrate the collapse of the old world? Your Majesty, I said, bowing with a mock seriousness that made her roll her eyes. As long as I get to pick the music for the coronation, I'm your man. As we walked out into the corridors of the Hegemony Dawn, the guards snapped to attention. They saw the Empress, glowing and radiant. But I saw the girl who had shared my last meal, And as we stepped toward the throne room, I knew that the universe was about to learn a very important lesson. That sometimes the most powerful thing in the stars isn't a fleet or a crown. It's the simple, stubborn kindness of a man who refuses to let a stranger be alone. The transformation had begun. It was painful, it was messy, and it was going to break everything. But as Vespera's hand tightened on mine, I knew it was the only way any of us were going to survive. We weren't just running anymore. We were leading, and the silence of the void was finally, blissfully, being broken by the sound of two people choosing to be a family. The heart of the Zenith hegemony was not a place of warmth or light. It was a cathedral of absolute, terrifying order. The Chamber of Sovereigns was a hollowed-out moon, its interior surfaces lined with the seats of the Council of 30, the advisors who managed the trillions of variables that constituted an interstellar empire. As Vespera and I walked down the central aisle, the sound of our footsteps, one pair clinical and graceful, the other heavy and discordant, echoed against the obsidian walls like a hammer hitting a tombstone. Vespera had refused the ceremonial floating platform. She walked on the floor, her hand firmly entwined with mine. I felt like a grease stain on a silk tapestry. I was still wearing the scavenged flight jacket over my formal imperial tunic, a deliberate choice that made the council members whisper behind their gloved hands. I looked like a man who had just crawled out of an engine manifold, which was exactly what I wanted them to see. "Radiance," the High Chancellor said, his voice a synthesized drone that carried no emotion. He sat at the highest point of the amphitheater, his face hidden behind a mask of shifting liquid silver. "The Kronos link is waiting. The Helion cluster is in open revolt. 3,000 ships are currently engaged in the siege of Viridia. Your silence has cost us 42 billion credits in trade revenue and over 600,000 lives. We must proceed with the reconnection immediately." Vespera stopped. The violet glow of her skin intensified, illuminating the dark stone beneath her feet. "I am aware of the numbers, Chancellor, but I am no longer interested in the cost of trade. I am interested in the cost of the souls." "The souls are the data," the Chancellor countered. "The data requires an anchor." "Then you shall have one," Vespera said, her voice dropping into a register that made the air itself vibrate. "But the anchor has changed. I will not reconnect to the link as a solitary vessel. I will reconnect through the lens of a person who has seen the dirt and tasted the hunger." A ripple of shock went through the council. I could hear the sharp intakes of breath, the rustle of ceremonial robes. Commander Valen, standing at the edge of the dais, looked at me with an expression that was halfway between horror and a strange budding respect. "Impossible," the Chancellor stated. "The protocol of the High Matriarch has stood for 4 millennia. To introduce a secondary consciousness, an unenhanced civilian consciousness, into the link would be to invite madness. The static of a single human life would drown out the signal of the 1,000 worlds." Daptin. "The static is the point," I spoke up, my voice sounding rough and unrefined in the sterile chamber. I felt Vespera's hand tighten on mine, a silent signal of encouragement. "You guys have been listening to a signal for so long that you've forgotten it's made of people. You see a revolution and you calculate the loss of credits. You don't see the kid hiding under a bunk while his station loses pressure. You don't see the scavenger who shares his last bar of protein because it's the only human thing left to do." I looked up at the silver-masked man. My eyes narrowed. "I'm not a genius. I'm just a guy who knows how to fix things that are broken. And your empire? It's the most broken thing I've ever seen. It's got a heart of starlight and a soul made of ice. Vespera is going back in there, but she's taking the static with her. She's taking the memory of a bad cup of coffee and a thermal blanket. Because that's the only thing that's going to keep her from becoming just another part of your machine." Vespera stepped forward, pulling me with her toward the great interface, a swirling vortex of violet light at the center of the room. "The Chancellor is right about one thing," she said, looking back at the council. "The signal is too loud, but with Kale as my anchor, I will not be drowned. I will be grounded. He is the choice I made when I had nothing. He is the family I chose when the stars were cold." The Chancellor stood, his silver mask rippling with agitation. "If you do this, Radiance, you risk everything. The link may reject you. You may both be vaporized by the sheer weight of the collective consciousness. I've survived a slingshot around a white dwarf in a ship held together by duct tape, I muttered, winking at Vespera. Vaporization sounds like a lateral move. Vespera didn't hesitate. She stepped into the vortex, her body dissolving into a pillar of pure, violet energy. For a split second, I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated terror. But then her hand, still solid and warm, pulled me in after her. The world didn't end. It expanded. I was no longer Cale Thorne, the scavenger from the weave. I was a billion people. I was the miner on a silicate moon, the mother in a luxury spire, the soldier in a trench, the child in a nursery. I felt the hunger, the joy, the grief, and the boredom of an entire civilization. It was a roar, a crushing weight that threatened to flatten my mind into nothingness. But in the center of the storm, there was a point of stillness. It was the memory of a silver wrapper crinkling in a dead station. It was the sound of a terrible joke told in a dark cockpit. It was the warmth of a thermal blanket. I held on to those memories with a desperation that was almost physical. I became the ground wire, the heavy iron rod that channeled the lightning of a billion lives into a single, manageable spark. Vespera was there, floating in the center of the light. She was crying, but she was smiling too. She was feeling it all, but she wasn't disappearing. She was filtering the data through her heart. The Helion cluster rebellion didn't end with a fleet engagement. It ended with a sudden, overwhelming wave of empathy that washed over every mind connected to the link. The soldiers stopped firing because they could feel the fear of the people they were shooting. The rebels stopped fighting because they could feel the exhaustion of the soldiers. It wasn't a tactical victory, it was a realization. The connection broke, and we tumbled back onto the obsidian floor of the chamber. I was gasping for air, my mind feeling like it had been through a tactical blender. Vespera was slumped beside me, her skin glowing with a soft, steady light that felt more like a sunset than a sun. The Council of 30 was silent. For the first time in 4 millennia, there were no calculations, no projections, no variables. There was just 30 people sitting in a room, looking at each other as if they were seeing themselves for the first time. "The war in the Helion cluster has ceased," Commander Valen whispered, his voice shaking. "The fleets are standing down. They're sending medical supplies to the surface. Both sides, at the same time." Vesper sat up, leaning her head against my shoulder. She looked at the Chancellor, whose silver mask had turned clear, revealing the face of an old, tired man. "The anchor is set," she said, her voice soft but absolute. "The protocol is dead. Long live the choice." I looked at her, and I knew that the scavenger's life was over. But as I saw the light of 1,000 worlds reflected in her violet eyes, I realized that I hadn't lost my freedom. I had just found something worth staying for. The Kepler belt looked different from the observation deck of the Hegemony Dawn. It no longer looked like a graveyard. It looked like a garden of possibilities. It had been 3 months since the Day of the Shared Soul, as the historians were already calling it, and the galaxy was still trying to figure out how to function when empathy was a mandatory part of the governing algorithm. The rust bucket was currently docked in the Imperial Bay, undergoing a series of repairs that were making the lead engineer cry. I'd insisted on keeping the original hull plates, carbon scoring and all. I told them it added character, but the truth was I wanted a reminder of where we'd been. You can't know how far you've traveled if you keep painting over the starting line. I was currently standing in the private gardens of the High Matriarch, wearing a pair of grease-stained coveralls that I'd stubbornly refused to trade for starlight silk. I was trying to fix a faulty irrigation sensor on a silver-leaf tree from the Helion cluster. "You know, for a consort of the Reach, you spend a surprising amount of time in the dirt," a voice said behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Vespera. She was wearing a simple blue dress, her golden hair loose and catching the artificial sunlight. She looked younger somehow. The weight of the crown was still there, but it didn't look like it was crushing her anymore. "Dirt is honest, Nova," I said, finally getting the sensor to click into place. "It doesn't try to negotiate trade tariffs or plan coups. You put water in, you get leaves out. It's a very straightforward transaction." She sat down on a stone bench, watching me work. "The Council is still complaining about your presence at the diplomatic meetings. Chancellor Myra says your tendency to narrate the negotiations like a sports broadcast is profoundly undignified. Yeah, but did the trade agreement with the Merchant Guild get signed? I asked, grinning. It did, mostly because they were so confused by your commentary that they forgot to argue about the shipping lanes. She laughed, a sound that still made my heart do a backflip. They are starting to understand, Kale. The people. They're sending messages through the link. Not data, but letters, stories. They're sharing their lives with me because they know I'm actually listening. I sat down beside her, wiping my hands on a rag. That's the thing about kindness. It's infectious. You give a little bit away, and suddenly everyone wants to see if they've got some in their pockets too. I looked out at the stars, the thousands of lights that represented the worlds we now looked after. My transformation wasn't a dramatic thing. I hadn't become a prince or a warrior. I was still Cale Thorne, a guy who was probably one bad decision away from a hull breach. But I was no longer a guy who was alone. I'd spent my whole life thinking that freedom meant having no attachments, no obligations, no weight. I thought that by drifting through the void, I was winning. But Vespera had shown me that a man without a home isn't free. He's just lost. And a home isn't a place. It isn't a station or a ship or an empire. It's the person who looks at your flaws and decides to stay anyway. I reached out and took her hand. It wasn't the hand of a goddess or an empress. It was the hand of my family. I used to look at the weave and see nothing but ghosts, I said quietly. I thought the universe was just a big empty machine that occasionally spat out some scrap for me to sell. I thought being human was a weakness, something that just made the hunger hurt more. I paused, looking at the silver leaves of the tree as they chimed in the breeze. But I was wrong. Being human is the only thing that actually matters. The scrap, the credits, the empires, they're all just noise. The only real thing is the choice to share your meal, the choice to hold a hand in the dark, the choice to be someone's anchor when the universe is trying to blow them away. I looked at Vespera, and for the first time in my 32 years of life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I wasn't a variable in an equation anymore. I was a man who was loved. I spent 10 years of my life running from anything that felt like a responsibility, thinking that every tie I cut made me lighter, faster, better. I treated my heart like a salvage operation, picking through the wreckage of my past and throwing away anything that didn't have immediate value. I thought that to survive the void, you had to be as cold and empty as the space between the stars. But standing here now, with the weight of an empire on one side and the warmth of a hand on the other, I realized that the only things truly worth carrying are the things that make you heavy. I learned that kindness isn't a luxury for the rich or a weakness of the poor. It is the primary fuel that keeps the soul from freezing over. I looked into the eyes of a woman who ruled 1,000 worlds, and I didn't see a queen. I saw a person who was just as scared and lonely as I was. And in that moment, I understood that we are all just scavengers in the dark, looking for a light that doesn't go out when the power fails. The only way we make it through the night is by sharing the light we have, even if it is just a flicker, even if it is just a half-eaten bar of protein and a terrible joke. I looked at the silver leaves, then back at the woman who had changed the trajectory of my life forever. "Hey, Nova," I said, a playful spark returning to my eyes. "I'm thinking about starting a cooking show for the entire hegemony. We'll call it Gourmet Scavenging. Episode 1, How to Make a 5-Course Meal Out of Nothing But Recycled Air and Hope." Vespera leaned her head against my shoulder, her eyes closing in content. "I think the galaxy is ready for that, Kale, just as long as you don't actually make them eat the protein bars." "Fair point," I laughed. "Those are an acquired taste." As the artificial sun set over the imperial garden, casting long, golden shadows across the silver trees, I felt a sense of peace that no amount of salvage could ever provide. The rust bucket was waiting, the stars were calling, and for the first time in history, the High Matriarch was going to have a very loud, very sarcastic breakfast narration. I spent my whole life thinking that being alone was the only way to be safe, until I met a woman who had everything and realized she was just as lost as I was. It made me wonder, in a universe so vast and indifferent, have you ever found yourself building walls to keep people out? only to realize you were just building your own prison? What would happen if you stopped looking for reasons to leave and started looking for the one person who makes you want to stay? I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small silver-wrapped bar, and broke it in two. I gave her the larger piece.